Alright, so I'm more of a game critic than a journalist, so gaming news isn't exactly what I expected to be writing about today, but even so, what I saw in this random article just struck me as so insane that I can't possibly ignore it. For the uninitiated, here is your 30-second history lesson. Once upon a time, there was a game development studio called Visceral Games that worked for everyone's least favorite, second least favorite publisher, EA. Visceral's biggest claim to fame was the creation of Dead Space under the direction of then-manager Glenn Schofield. Visceral eventually was devoured by EA, and Dead Space as a franchise was left dead after a trilogy of games was released, technically. The following year after the first Dead Space's release, Schofield left and co-founded Sledgehammer Games of Call of Duty fame until that was eventually eaten by Activision. Oof, tough break, 2 for 2. Fast forward to 2019, and Schofield announced that he was joining Krafton Inc., the PUBG people, and both that partnership and the many veteran Dead Space developers that followed him formed Striking Distance Studios. A handful more years later, and Striking Distance Studios has launched their first AAA game, The Callisto Protocol, which you may have noticed as being the topic of my last video before this one, which released to mixed, if not generally positive reviews. Congrats, now you're all caught up, now onto the matter at hand. Striking Distance Studios have already lost their minds after releasing just their first major game. The Callisto Protocol is a purely single-player action horror game which, love it or hate it, is inarguably at least competent. The game clearly had a lot of budget and talent behind it, but regardless of whether or not you think it lived up to the hype, we can all agree that the game isn't completely perfect. Even the most polished of games have little quirks and things that are very slightly wrong with them that people are inevitably going to find and either be frustrated by or have fun with, such as the nature of finite programming in the face of millions of human players. Unfortunately, Striking Distance doesn't seem to accept that, and they are threatening action against anyone who does. Let me explain. Games aren't perfect. They will, with almost no exceptions, inevitably have some form of bugs or glitches that were unintended by the developers and also manage to slip through the quality assurance game testers. Whatever the case, games have glitches, and glitches more often than not interact with the player in one of two ways. Glitches can either get in the way of playing the game, or they can purposefully be triggered by players who are aware of them in order for those imperfections to be exploited for entertainment, hence the term exploits in a gaming context. Glitches often simply are what they are, and devs will focus most on patching those which prevent the game from being fair, balanced, or in some cases even playable. The Callisto Protocol is an excellent example of this, as Striking Distance has been hard at work patching the game to better optimize its performance on all platforms and fix the crashes and dying frame rates. However, they've also taken an extremely aggressive stance on any and all forms of bugs and glitches in the game, and moreover, anyone who uses bugs and glitches in the game to play in a manner that they didn't explicitly intend. Enter the Callisto Protocol Rules of Conduct. This is admittedly something that I actually completely glossed over when I had the chance to read it myself, and for the record, I did uninstall and reinstall the game in hopes of getting this pop-up again, but once you agree for the first time, the menus are now inaccessible without rooting through the game's actual files, which, as we will soon read, is actually illegal. I skim-read the terms of service, but I didn't even register that this game had rules of conduct, because why would it have rules of conduct? It's a single-player game. It's not even co-op. The way that you play has no impact on the experience of anyone other than yourself. Striking Distance, however, does not care, and it was only a matter of time until someone noticed. Sophia Narwitz on Twitter decided to scroll through and took pictures of some very particularly worrying rules. Let's read these together. If we jump to the top paragraph of this picture, it essentially just says that unauthorized changes to anything surrounding the game, be it the client that it runs on, files, packets, servers, or otherwise internal data, are all strictly prohibited under penalty of copyright law, which, in the context of piracy, is perfectly fine, but it also means that the modding community is effectively dead in the water. And then we get to one of the bigger ones, because that wasn't bad enough. Quote, "Do not exploit vulnerabilities in the game, as defined as bugs and glitches. Users exploiting errors and bugs while playing the game with a capital G, by the way, just in case you forgot that this is actually a perfect game that's holy, will be held liable for serious penalties. We reserve the right to take action against those who take unfair advantage through official procedures, and all acquired in-game items and other data will be forfeited and removed." There is, needless to say, a ton wrong with this on principle, like how, for example, if you're playing the game within its own boundaries and by their own words using, quote, official procedures, then no amount of progress or advantages can be considered unfair. First of all, because you're only playing the game in the way that it allows you to in the first place, and second, there is no situation where you can be considered to quote-unquote have an unfair advantage because there's no one to have an advantage over. Next, the verbiage, errors and bugs found while playing, meaning that these proposed penalties aren't reserved for a list of known exploits the developers have found. It means that even if you are the first person to discover a glitch while playing, and then you make use of whatever it is you found, you may be subject to these penalties. So to be incredibly clear, if you are using existing bugs or glitches, or even bugs and glitches that you discover yourself while playing to in any way help progress in the game, you may be subject to having your in-game inventory stripped from you and your in-game data deleted. Let's move on. Do not use offensive nicknames. I mean, yeah, it kind of speaks for itself. Sure, telling people to not go out of their way to offend others is... I mean, you shouldn't have to say that, just don't intentionally be a bad person, but given the context, you can't even nickname yourself or any other character in the game, which means that I guess they're talking about outside of the game. Like, don't use offensive nicknames in conversations surrounding the game, which, no, you don't get to tell people how they're allowed to talk, nor will you be able to define what every individual person could consider offensive even if you tried to. It's neither their place nor authority to tell you what you can and cannot say, nor is it an enforceable rule. So lastly, let's skip to the other big one. Do not play the game abnormally. If any abnormal gameplay patterns are detected, i.e. gameplay that goes against the intentions of how our game, again, capital G, just in case you forgot, is meant to be played, measures could be taken against the account that performs such actions in order to create a fair gameplay environment. And again, I ask, fair gameplay environment for whom? There's only one player. What qualifies as being unfair if the only one that you could conceivably cheat is yourself? And real quick, I checked over my footage from my first playthrough and looked over the rules that I did actually bring up on screen. There are a few more concerning ones, at least in a vacuum. First, you may not use the information obtained through the game, whether by copying, duplicating, modifying, translating, publishing, or otherwise providing this information to others without prior consent from the company. Again, just really cracking down on the potential modding community here, because they even specifically choose to use the term modifying. No amount of this game is allowed to be open source for people to alter in any capacity ever. And then there's just one more paragraph talking about how every bug and glitch should be reported to striking distance, and no bug or glitch is allowed to be exploited or used in-game. So in conclusion, instead of accepting that their programming wasn't spectacular and then planning around the fact that people were inevitably going to break their game, Striking Distance had the absolutely Nobel Prize-worthy idea to threaten and punish their brand new player base for acknowledging and utilizing the imperfections in their imperfect game and doing what the game allows you to do. They have put a hard lockdown on anyone who had any hopes of modding the game for any reason, which, considering that the game was released through Steam on PC, and the large number of fans who were initially disappointed with the game, was certainly more than a few people, and the almost bigger problem, speedrunning the Callisto Protocol is essentially illegal. If you use any glitches in the game to progress, take shortcuts, or gain materials, Striking Distance Studios will fittingly be waiting within striking distance to punch your account in the face, either through the deletion of your inventory, entire save files, or depending on which rules they claim you've broken, potentially even legal action. And all of these penalties are for players who use exploits in what I will remind you for one final time is a single player only game. No high scores, no leaderboards, no competitive elements, no online elements, no co-op elements, nothing. Just you, a sparky stick, and the freaks of nature on a giant snowy rock. The sad thing is, I'm usually on the side of the developers whenever this kind of issue comes up, and I know it's not a popular take, but as far as I'm concerned as a creative, if you've made something, it's yours. If you make a thing, generally you should have some say of how people use it within a level of ethical reason. I would argue this is solidly outside of that realm of reason. Take, for example, Nintendo and Smash Bros., a company that is entirely against exploits or glitches, be they fun or game-breaking, and one who also doesn't like how many diehard fans play the game. There's a bit of me that understands, not agrees with, but understands if Nintendo wants to shut down a tournament. You're making profit off their product, you're playing a game very publicly in a way that they don't want you to. I can do those mental gymnastics. But now, instead, picture an alternate world where even the ever-strict Nintendo is like striking distance. A world where Nintendo is prepared to delete the memory card and even fine every Melee player who has even ever publicly used a wave dash. Congratulations, striking distance. We can see that you're really making EA and Activision proud. And I will see you, yes you, next time, with hopefully better news.